There's a fairly prominent YouTuber, Protestant, who I saw a video that was recently released where basically he says this is the whopper stopper reason never to become Catholic or Orthodox is veneration of icons. Yeah,
and really you would think that in that video, which we'll touch upon the major arguments, you think maybe there'd be something new there, but Gary, there really is nothing new under the sun. People may say, well, why go over this again? Because it is important to the apostolic churches. It is part of the apostolic faith, that being having images, having statues, venerating images, venerating statues. Of course, when we talk about venerating them, I think we'll describe what do we mean by that. As the councils are very clear, as the early fathers are clear, we don't mean giving direct veneration to a marble or to ink or what have you. As the early fathers are very clear, the veneration goes directly to the saint that is being represented. I think that's really, really important. And that point at times really does tend to get lost because people will then they'll confuse the veneration that is given to saints. And then they will then say, well, you're not supposed to have any idols. We agree. They're not idols. We are venerating the saints. Idols were being worshipped. They were being put in place of the one true God. That was condemned. They're not even, it's comparing apples to oranges. They're not even remotely the same thing. And I think today we're going to have a lot of fun delving into the Bible, early church, and we're going to look a little bit at, we always hear about a council. So people, you're going to have to stick around till later in the show. We're going to talk about the Council of Elvira. We always hear about the Council of Elvira. People may say, well, William, I can't find any information on it. You're probably not going to find much on it. It's a very obscure council. But we always hear that there was an early church council that condemned images. Catholics, why do you have images in your churches? We're going to cover all that today, brother.
Yeah, that's awesome. Before we begin, though, you've done a lot of research in Orthodoxy and you've done debates with Orthodox. Mm-hmm. Do Orthodox churches and the Catholic Church, are we basically one in terms of our veneration, or is there any difference between us?
Yeah, so here's the important thing, and I'm going to make a distinction that maybe people have not heard on your show before. Now, I'm going to add another group to that mix because you're going to frequently have Protestants say, well, look, of course, Catholics and Orthodox, by the way, we are on the same page when it comes to venerating images. But the Protestants are going to say, well, of course, before the split, you both were united. And at the Second Council of Nicaea is when this dastardly practice was introduced. But we have a problem here, Gary, because it's not just Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, but we have our Syriac Orthodox, which broke apart from us well before the Second Council of Nicaea. In fact, they don't hold to the Council of Chalcedon. They were no longer part. We were no longer united by the time we get to Chalcedon in the 5th century. So the argument wants to be used from Protestants that Second Nicaea introduced this novel practice. Why is it that our other apostolic brothers and sisters, the Syriac Orthodox, venerate images, and they will say, we're right there with you, Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. This is apostolic. Gary, I'm going to make the argument, and I think a very good biblical and patristic case can be made. The reason is because this is an apostolic practice. It is ancient, and we can prove it is ancient.
All right. Awesome. Very good. So what are the why don't we start with the objections to the veneration of icon? Where does that come from?
And it really is important to begin right in the beginning, where you have people objecting. They will say, well, look, what you've got directly in the Bible, you've got it right there in the book of Exodus 20, where it says, you shall have no other gods before me. Don't make a graven image. And it tells you, you shall not bow down to them or serve them. Catholics, why are you bowing down to images? Why are you serving them? So number one, the condemnation in Exodus 20, Gary, is right there in verse 3. You shall have no other gods before me. So number one, these were not any regular images. These were idols. People were committing idolatria. They were giving latria. Latria is the Greek word that is exclusive worship to God and God alone. So if you give latria, which means worship, to an idol or to anything or anyone other than the one true God, that is idolatry. And you're making that individual or that image or anything, you're making it into an idol if you're worshiping it. Catholics don't worship images. Now, Gary, I don't even know any Catholic, at least I've never run into one, that believes an image actually is a living deity. And they put flowers there because it's a living God. No, the flowers and the bowing are duliuo. Dulia means veneration, and the veneration is given to the saint that is being represented. Can we venerate saints? We can. According to the book of Galatians, we're told that we should serve one another, duliuo, in love. It is a perfectly biblical concept that we can serve each other in love. But who do we worship? We worship the one true God. So the prohibition, Gary, is against idols. You do not make any statue or anything into a god and serve it and worship it. That is what is being condemned. And I think once we get that down, Gary, I really think it allows us to have even deeper dialogue with our evangelical friends.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the wording in Exodus you probably want to highlight is you shall not bow down to them or serve them. In other words, you could take that as a prohibition not to serve them as they are, like as idols. But like you pointed out, with icons and statues, we don't serve the statues or the icons.
Yep.
What we do is those things point to the saints. So it's really, that's the object of our veneration.
Great point there, Gary. And I think that really is perhaps the disconnect where we are dialoguing with our evangelical friends and they don't get that point. And perhaps, and I don't want to blame them alone, maybe our fellow Catholics are unable to really break it down in a very clear fashion. And hopefully shows like this are able to help them, enrich them, realize, okay, what is being condemned? And even more so, Gary, if you continue reading the book of Exodus, you find out why there was this condemnation. If you look at what we're told of Aaron in the book of Exodus chapter 32, what is occurring here? This is blatant idolatry, Gary. You read verse 2 and on. What are we told? It says, and he received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool, and he made a molded calf. Now, Gary, maybe it would have been fine and dandy if there were statues being made and what have you, but what was being done was they were making statues and worshiping them. We're told right there. Then they said, this is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt. Now, Gary, that is the utmost blasphemy to claim that an idol is your God. It brought you out of the land of Egypt. And so people will then say, well, no. They were doing what Catholics are doing in giving this kind of honor. They didn't really say or believe they were their gods. We're told right there. If we look at scripture as our evangelical friends want us to do, if we look at it and take it at face value, Gary, the direct language tells us this is your God. And Gary, this is blatant idolatry. And not only that, when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it. What do you do on altars? You offer sacrifice. You do not offer up offerings on an altar to a regular creature. You offer up sacrifices on an altar, a thusiasterion, to the one true God only. So this is idolatry at the highest form, Gary. And I think when we realize all of that, look, I got to be honest, Gary, I've yet to see any Catholic put a statue up on an altar and offer the Eucharist up to the statue. That would be idolatry. Rather, we offer all our sacrifices to the one true God, not to any golden creation done by hand.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of hard not to giggle when you say stuff like that because, as a lifelong Catholic, it just sounds so ridiculous when you put it that way. And yet, there's this horrible misunderstanding. But yeah, really, really great points in terms of this idea, the altar to the statue. I think that's a great point.
Yeah, and I would even add, Gary, that even because people will then say, well, no, look, if you look at the Greek has latruo, and it even has dulia for veneration. So Catholics, you can't even venerate images. Well, let me break it down for the audience. A real meat and potatoes point that we've got to make. We agree with the text. Dulia would be incorrect to be given to a golden calf, even in and of itself, because you don't render veneration or service to an inanimate object in place of the one true God, because that amounts to worship in and of itself. So either which way we look, Gary, I think it really is important to note, number one, we are allowed to give veneration to creatures. That is a biblical concept. We're not giving veneration to marble or to mere gold or to mere, we're not worshiping a gold. We're not worshiping any kind of created substance. Rather, when we look at a picture of Christ, we drop to our knees. I have the representation of our Lord in mind when I give worship to our one true God. And I know that is not what they were doing here, Gary. Thus, it tells you this is your God. Catholics don't do that.
William, yeah, great stuff. It's some very important distinctions that need to be made, in the Old Testament between using images and worshiping images. And so, yeah, good stuff.
Yeah, I think those are really good points there, Gary, as well, because if the commandment was a complete abolition against any kind of images, Gary, we would expect that to have been a consistent one. Rather, when we look all throughout the Old Testament, you've got the serpent, the brazen serpent. You've got the Ark of the Covenant, which was very ornate. You have images used all throughout the scriptures, Gary. So it's very clear that the condemnation is not about actually images being utilized or allowed. Rather, the condemnation is about idolatry. I think that is an important point. Once we really lay that point out, we're able to move on. And I think when we do move on, we arrive at Ezekiel 41, which is a very important passage, because in Ezekiel 41 we read, "And he said to me, this is the most holy place. In front of the holy place was an altar of wood. He said to me, this is a table that stands before the Lord." So this is the idealized temple. We're getting a vision of the ideal temple in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 41, and we read, "This is a table that stands before the Lord, and it was made," in verse 18, "with cherubim and palm trees," a palm tree between cherub and cherub. Each cherub had two faces, so that the face of a man was toward a palm tree on one side, and the face of a young lion toward a palm tree on the other side. From the floor to the space above the door and on the wall of the sanctuary, cherubim and palm trees were carved. These are carved images, Gary, in the most holy place, before altars in a holy place that stood before the Lord. We continue reading. "On the doors of the nave were carved cherubim and palm trees, such as were carved on the walls." So this is really, really important, Gary, because if God had put a condemnation against images, against statues, we would not expect them to be utilized, and not only utilized, Gary, but utilized in a positive sense, I think is the important thing we have to emphasize.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, even when you look at the detailed description of the making of the temple, there's images everywhere. They're carved into the doors, the walls, the different ornaments there, plus the two giant cherubim over the Ark of the Covenant. I mean, it's just loaded with images. And again, you don't have a peep about, well, this is in violation of what God said in Exodus.
Yeah, no doubt at all there, Gary. And really good points you do make there, because the vision that we have here, I think that is the important thing we've got to really focus upon, because our evangelical friends will really scoff not only at the idea of having saints, the idea of any kind of statuary, any kind of images. And if you notice, very quite common in Catholic churches are having angels. Very frequently, you find one of the parishes I attend very often, we have a gorgeous statue of the great archangel, St. Michael. So if you stop and you condemn that, well, we've got a very big issue here, because cherubim are angelic beings, and they are consonant with worship and praise of God, and they're present here in the Old Testament, in the book of Ezekiel. We know when we read the book of Revelation, chapter 4, angels give glory, honor, and they magnify the great glorious power of God. Thus, why they're utilized in such a positive sense in the book of Ezekiel 41. And not only are they utilized in a positive sense, Gary, as the text very clearly lays out, they are in the holiest of holy places. And Gary, I think that is incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's close to the center of God's presence in the temple. So there's obviously it's not an offense against God, at least not their presence isn't. There's plenty of evidence in the Old Testament and leading right up till the time of Christ.
Yeah, no doubt. And before we go to break there, I do want to look and read, because give a little bit of time to the Council of Elvira. Now, for the audience, maybe wondering, we're going to look at other stuff. We're going to look at early church fathers and what have you. I'm glad I was able to pull it up fast. But before we go to the break, I do want to touch upon one other thing that we'll hear very often, because you'll find out that, okay, well, Scripture doesn't support the case that evangelicals are putting forth. We can utilize, which we will in a bit, early church fathers from a very early period onward. But then we're going to get told, well, look, Catholics, even if the Synod of Elvira, even if that was not an ecumenical council, you guys have local councils that were very valuable, even utilized, the material utilized from them in ecumenical councils. And we give a hearty amen to that. The synods of Hippo and Carthage and the canon were instrumental in really driving forth the importance at Florence and Trent. So we agree with that. And it would be something to really look at when we examine, because when we look at the Council Elvira in the 300s, we find a very interesting text, and it's in Canon 36. It reads, "It has seemed good that images should not be in churches, so that what is venerated and worshipped not be painted on the walls." Now, that is from the Council of Elvira in the 4th century. And I remember, Gary, many years back, preparing for debate, looking at that canon and reading the other canons before and thinking, why? What on earth is going on here? Who presided over this council? Why would it have condemned images? What is going on here? Now, Gary, if I recommend anybody, go ahead and look at the documents, the canon section of Elvira. Once you get to Canon 36, it really does seem out of place and seem weird. But fine, either which way, whether it seems weird or out of place, it has got to be dealt with. Why would there be a condemnation on images to begin with? Even if this canon seems out of place, even if it doesn't make sense to us, Catholics and Orthodox should be able to respond to it. And I think the best kind of response we can give, and one that I don't know if it's being utilized more, I have not heard anybody else bring it up, but I brought it up multiple times in debates. Every kind of scholarship that I have looked at, Gary, including the top scholarship in German, multiple German journals that have looked at these texts, none of them believe the canons after Canon 21 and beyond are even valid, meaning they are interpolations. So here is a problem that our evangelical friends then have to deal with. They've got to deal with the overwhelming massive amount of scholarship that does not believe that this is genuinely part of the canons of Elvira, meaning if it sounds and seems like it's out of place, which it does, and scholarship is telling us they believe it to be an interpolation, well, then the burden of proof is on our evangelical friends of proving that this is a valid kind of context, a valid canon, when there are no other councils that exist anywhere remotely similar in the region, when all of the early fathers that we have around that time period before and after are not anti-icon fathers. They are not. Rather, they defend the utilization of images in the proper context. So that massive burden of proof would be against those that are against images. Prove to us that that is a real canon when the actual scholars that have looked at Elvira will tell you they do not believe it to be a genuine canon. Not genuine, meaning an interpolation means it is fraudulent.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's incredibly important.
Yeah.
So it is a square peg in a round hole. The surrounding context just doesn't make sense. It just seems to pop in there out of nowhere. Do you know if there's manuscript problems or any kind of indication in the manuscripts that this is a later edition? Yeah, there are. In everything I've read, there are a ton of manuscript problems. That could be why that has led them to believe. And notice how, for the audience, it would be convenient if these scholars would have an axe to grind and they would say, no, that canon is an interpolation. No. Rather, they're arguing that all of them after 21, this is canon 36, meaning there are a ton others. They're arguing that all of them after 21, they are interpolations. And I would recommend that the audience, you can find it on Wikipedia, go and look at them and read them. Now, you're not going to find the German scholarship in Wikipedia. You can, I don't know where you could find that. I don't know if it's free online. I had to actually purchase the physical books. I've got them and I've translated those texts. But you can read on Wikipedia all of the canons. And once you get past 21, you're going to say, whoa, that really doesn't make a lot of sense. And it could be very well why that they are interpolations, as the scholars have said they are. So I think that really is important because people tend to get confused and say, well, okay, what is going on? And by the way, I recently, about 4 or 5 months ago, I talked with a Spaniard who just wrote the only book that I've been able to find anywhere, the only modern day book, all of it on Elvira. It's a massive book, 100% dedicated to Elvira, dedicated to the manuscript tradition, dedicated to what is said in there. I talked to them over the phone. We're going to do a show in the future. This was many months ago. And I asked him, what are your thoughts on these canons? He says they are not from Elvira. We don't know where they are from. They are rather late, and we have no idea what century they came in. That, Gary, does propose a major problem because if they are interpolations, if they're not part of the original text, then we run into the issue of who added them? What group added them? An unorthodox group, very clearly, because the ancient church, the Apostolic Church, would not have, never, you don't have any evidence of them ever issuing such a decree. Yeah, very good. Now, what's the date usually given for a Council of Elvira? You said 3rd century?
307, 4th century.
Okay, excellent. All right. Very interesting stuff about the Council of Elvira. I didn't know about the those later canons being spurious. Very important to know.
It really is, Gary. And it really, my opinion, it really could be a bit of the reason being that the majority of scholarship in Elvira, I have found, at least when I did deep digging, about 90% of it is either in Spanish or in Spanish and German only. And I think I found a few books in French. I don't know French, but by the grace of God, I am fluent in German and Spanish. So I was able to take advantage of that and do deep digging. But I have found that there's very little, if any, work that has been done on Elvira in English. Who knows? Maybe one day that will change. But let me add to that one point, Gary, that people may not know. Maybe about a year ago, I did a show with the Reverend Dr. Price, who has written the only translation in English on the Act of Second Nicaea. He is a scholar of the utmost scholars on images and statues. And before the show, we dialogued, and I told him, I presented to him my scholarship on Elvira, He told me, William, your scholarship and your conclusions on Elvira are very well founded. And it really does, the scholarship really does lean in that area. So we have one of the top scholars that, funny enough, evangelicals love to point to him. And yet he does no favor to their position whatsoever. That really is the irony there, isn't it, Gary?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So Second Nicaea and Elvira's, the canons are spurious. Second Nicaea isn't, though. And
No.
Nicaea spoke in favor of images.
Absolutely. And you would expect one of the top scholars in this area to have to know a little bit about a council that would have talked about images and what have you. But it really does get us to the other point, Gary, and that is, okay, well, if we're going to talk about images, if we're going to talk about statuary or what have you, well, where do we have any evidence of it being utilized in the early church? Number one, I want to add one important thing. I know we have evidence such as the Dura Europos synagogue and much other archaeological evidence. I make the argument that the evidence of statuary or images would be very limited in the early church. Why would I make that argument? Well, Gary, goodness, they're being martyred left and right. They're on the run for their lives. You don't expect there to be churches like the one that you're going to attend down the street, set up on every street corner. Think about how difficult, not only difficult, but nearly impossible that would have been. That is why it's the amount of archaeological evidence, even though I believe it to be significant, is not as explosive as it becomes later in church history. But the evidence of utilizing images in a positive sense all over the early church. We've got St. Clement of Alexandria, writing in the late 100s, either the late 190s or early 200s, who tells us in his On the Instructor, and let our seals be either a dove or a fish or a ship scudding before the wind, or a musical lyre, which Polycrates used, or a ship's anchor, which Seleucus got engraved as a device. And if there be one fishing, he will remember the apostle and the children drawn out of the water. I want to urge the audience to realize the great Clement of Alexandria was one of the leaders of the catechetical school of Alexandria. Not only that, he was a patristic giant. What is he saying? Let our seals be a dove or a fish. What does the fishing represent? The apostles. It represents the ministry that the apostles are called to. They are to catch and bring people into the ship. But what is a dove? What is it always represented? It has always represented the Holy Spirit. That is incredibly important. And Clement of Alexandria is not talking about, well, you know what? I saw this example or this off kind of example. No, rather, this is very clearly something that was common, because he says, let our seals, these are something engraved. These are images. And Gary, I think this is an incredibly important point that we need to put forth as positive images, positive evidence of the utilization of images in the early church.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
They just didn't spring out of nowhere. It wasn't till the time of Clement, then all of a sudden there's this new fad and a complete change from before. But like I said, I agree with you too. I think it was probably rare, certainly in the early church, certainly during persecutions, that you would have statues and so on.
And there really is nothing wrong with that, because you find that once you find references here and there utilized in a positive sense, but once you find Christians able to worship more freely, not only do you find images mentioned and utilized much more often, but you have way more epistles being written as well. That is why when you get to the time of a great Augustine, the great St. Augustine, his works are voluminous, whereas the works of a St. Ignatius of Antioch are 7 short letters. The church was literally on the run. The great saints were being martyred left and right. So when the writings become much more voluminous because they're not being killed like they were before, They're able to worship after the Edict of Milan much more openly, much more freely, despite being under persecution endlessly in some form or another. You then have the utilization of images more. In fact, talking about the great Augustine, you have the great Augustine telling us when he's arguing against the Manichaeans, he says, for Abraham to sacrifice his son of his own accord is shocking madness. His doing so at the command of God proves him faithful and submissive. This is so loudly proclaimed by the very voice of truth that Faustus, eagerly rummaging for some fault and reduced at last to slanderous charges, has not the boldness to attack this action. It is scarcely possible that he can have forgotten a deed so famous. Well, how could he forget this deed? That it recurs to the mind of itself without any study or reflection, and is in fact repeated by so many tongues and portrayed in so many places that no one can pretend to shut his eyes or ears to it. The literal Latin has, as you can see, pictum. Many translations don't say portrayed, they say painted in many places. Now, people are going to recognize it and understand it because this event was painted in many places. Now, Gary, this is significant because if images were so dastardly, well, why doesn't the great Augustine speak out against them? And you would expect Augustine, influenced by horrific paganism, who becomes Catholic, and the number one duty of his is to provide apologetic works, showing the world why paganism is false and why you must worship the one true God in Trinity. That becomes his life defense on the Trinity and many other works. You would think that if images and statuary were horrific and they were condemned and this was pagan, that the great Augustine would have been aware of this, being such a stalwart of the faith. He would have known this, he would have heard this in the churches, but there's no such indication of that. Rather, the utilization of images in a positive sense is right there present in the great Augustine.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. I wasn't familiar with the Latin there, but
Yeah.
Very cool stuff. Yeah, and of course, even before that, with the paintings and icons that were in the catacombs too. I mean, you can even point to that as that's early Christian art right there. And many times, the Holy Sacrifice of Mass was held down there.
Absolutely, Gary. Many times it was, and we have so much evidence of that as well. I think that when we weigh the massive amount of evidence, Gary, it really falls on one side, and it falls on the side of images being allowed, being commended, being utilized in holy places. And really, we get this. Where do we get it from? The very model was laid out as being proper and being correct and being beautiful in Holy Writ. In the very Old Testament that we were reading earlier, the Old Testament that we're told that condemns these kinds of images, these arguments, really, they don't work, Gary. They fall apart. And really, it really should not be an idea of coming to the table and wanting to be combative and wanting to say, well, look, our evangelical friends, you all are fools. No, we want to come to the table in a charitable way. We want to say, look, we love having our images because it reminds us of the deep love we have for the Lord, our incredible love for our Holy Mother Mary, for all the saints that we believe are our great intercessors. We love them with all our hearts, and these images help our love increase because we see them, and it brings to memory how great our God is, because our God has done great things for his wonderful followers of the faith, Gary. And when we break it down that way, and we tell our evangelical friends, let's look at the Old Testament, then let us look at early church history. And I think that really does open the door for being able to see things and being able to realize, okay, well, the early church doesn't seem to be anti-icon. And if the early church was not anti-icon, and if the only evidence is from a spurious canon, nothing else, well, I think the evidence really does weigh in favor of the Catholic position, and not just a little bit, but overwhelmingly.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, good stuff. William, hey, we're coming up to the last minute. As always, whenever you're on the show, I don't know, but time just flies. Tell us a little bit about what you're up to. What's any projects on board?
Yeah, a lot that I am working on. Thank the good Lord. I'm back in the saddle. I was sidelined a little bit there as I had a little bit of an family emergency. Things seeming to be great now. A lot of debates down the pipeline that are coming up. Working on more books, working on more projects. Everybody, we're going to be doing a live show very soon, God willing, as well, over at the Apocrypha Apocalypse. Stay tuned. Subscribe over there. Hit like, share everything you can, and keep praying for me and pray for Gary and his amazing ministry as well.
Well, thank you, William. Yeah, absolutely. And you're doing such great work at patristicpillars.com and your own channel, William Albrecht, on YouTube. You got lots of great programs, and it's great to have you back on the show, William. As always, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. Look forward to being back.
All right. William Albrecht, patristicpillars.com. Check it out.